The existence of PlayStation happens because of the infamous betrayal that was done by Nintendo one day after the Consumer Electronics Show in 1991, where they are making a console as a part of their collaboration project. From that betrayal, Sony got triggered to make their own console that later changed the image of the gaming industry. And the rest is history. Since I've been talking about the history of PlayStation in the few last videos, I'm gonna put PlayStation aside. And this episode, we're going to talk about the history of Nintendo, from just selling the handmade card game to become the gaming giant that we know until today. My name is Luthfi, and you just tuning in to Saturday Stories. Wait, the handmade card game? I thought Nintendo is an electronic game company. How come they were used to sell the card game? Okay, let me explain about the establishment of Nintendo. Nintendo were established in 1889 in Kyoto, Japan by Fusajiro Yamauchi, where way before they become the gaming giant, selling a console, and even have their own IP, they used to selling their handcrafted Hanafuda, which is the Japanese traditional playing cards. Where the Westerns have this, the Japanese one at a time have this. The cards businesses were kept growing even under the new leadership, including the grandson of the founder Hiroshi Yamauchi, who became as the president of Nintendo in 1949. During Hiroshi's regime, Nintendo changed their company name into Nintendo Playing Cards in 1950, and as of 1953, Nintendo became as the first company to successfully produce the plastic playing cards. In 1959, Nintendo wanted to try to approach the children's market by partnering with Walt Disney, and then they adding some Disney characters on the card. In 1963, Nintendo changed their company name again by just Nintendo, keeping the playing cards out of their name. Because besides of the playing cards, Hiroshi led Nintendo to do some different ventures, like taxi service, instant noodles, electronic toys, even a love hotel. But unfortunately, except of the electronic toys, some of the ventures were failed, but it showed the way that Nintendo's boldness to the experiment. The things has changed in 1970s when Nintendo released the electronic toys called the beam gun, or in Japanese it is called as the Kosenju SP. Where the Kosenju itself, it literally means the beam gun or the beam weapon. Correct me if I'm wrong. Where the beam gun pioneered Nintendo to make the famous NES peripheral, the Zapper. In 1977, Nintendo released the first home console called the Color TV game, where there's two different types of Color TV games, which is Color TV Game 6 and Color TV Game 15. The number in the console name indicates how many games are included in each unit. Nintendo also developed the arcade hits like Shigeru Miyamoto's Donkey Kong, where in that game it is also introduced the character called Jumpman, that later known as Mario, who became as the famous icon of Nintendo a few moments later. For those who don't know who is Shigeru Miyamoto is a game producer and designer who worked for Nintendo from 1977, where currently he working as the representative director and a fellow at Nintendo. If 1970s is the moment where Nintendo introduced the first home console and bringing the arcade hits, 1980s is the moment where Nintendo was getting their peak. We're gonna start the 80s with the Game & Watch that released in 1980. The first handheld that designed by Gunpei Yokoi were inspired by the guy who playing a pocket calculator on a tray. The Game & Watch itself could only play one game in just one device, and Nintendo also released the multi-screen clamshell design for Game & Watch that later inspired Nintendo to create the Nintendo DS. After the launch of their first handheld, Nintendo brings the 8-bit definitions by create the console that later defines the golden era of Nintendo. Yep, that's right. In 1983, Nintendo launched the Family Computer in Japan, and in 1985, Nintendo launched the US version of the Famicom called Nintendo Entertainment System, of course with the gray box as the main unit. During its lifetime, the Nintendo Entertainment System were almost 62 million units were sold around the world. The console that bring in the games like Super Mario Bros., Metroid, The Legend of Zelda, and Duck Hunt, where you must play that game with a zapper, revived the global gaming industry after 1983 crash. After the successful Game & Watch, followed by the huge success of the NES, Nintendo really want to make the successor to Game & Watch, where they want to make the handheld device more durable and even more portable. And that's how Gunpei Yokoi designed and later launched the Game Boy in 1989. Why do I say the Game & Watch is more portable and durable? Because the Game Boy can play many games in just one device thanks to the swappable cartridge features. The handheld device that gave birth to Kirby in Kirby's Dream Land and Pikachu in Pokemon Red and Blue have a long battery life where it brings the huge advantage over the rivals. And Nintendo also released the Game Boy Pocket and Game Boy Light for the other model for Nintendo Game Boy. And the game called Tetris, which is the second bestseller game, is the one of the reason that people want to buy the Game Boy. The release of Game Boy capping off the 80s decade. Now it's time we're heading to the 90s, where Nintendo want to make the successor to the NES, where they want to bring the 16-bit definition games. And that's how in 1990, Nintendo launched Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or simply the Super Nintendo. The console that bringing the games like Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and Donkey Kong Country, where approximately 49 million units were sold. The Super Nintendo itself were powered by Sony's SPC700 audio chip that brings the iconic music quality. Since Sony powers that audio chip, Nintendo feels like they interest to have a teamwork with them. And that's how in 1991, Sony and Nintendo introduced the Nintendo PlayStation, which is the part of the collaboration project between Sony and Nintendo itself. The Nintendo PlayStation is a hybrid console where you can play the games with CD and even a cartridge, just in one machine. And Nintendo PlayStation were introduced in Consumer Electronics Show in 1991. But one day after the Consumer Electronics Show, due to the contract issue, the collaboration between Nintendo and Sony were scrapped and cancelled. And Nintendo chose to partnering with Philips the moment after Nintendo and Sony's partnership contract was cancelled. The reason why did Nintendo choose to betray Sony and suddenly choose to teamwork with Philips is because Nintendo were very afraid that Sony wanted to maintain the control over the software license and royalties for its games, because originally, according to the contract, Sony didn't guarantee that thing. If you want to know more about how did Nintendo have interest to team up with Sony, you can watch this video about the history of PlayStation. As I mentioned, a day after the Consumer Electronics Show 1991, Nintendo chose to team up with Philips, where their collaboration project originally wanted to make the CD add-on for Super Nintendo, but unfortunately, it is cancelled. But instead, Philips got licensing rights to use Nintendo characters. And then Philips launched the CDI, where it is actually not a joint console, but it is a Philips standalone console, but with a Nintendo character. The games like Link: The Faces of Evil, Zelda: The Wind of Gamelon, and Hotel Mario were considered as the worst entries in Zelda and Mario history. Nintendo chose to betray Sony, and then they teamed up with Philips for the CD project, but later the CDI became as their time bomb. In 1995, Nintendo wanted to experiment in the virtual reality console by launching the Virtual Boy. Since it only have a red and black graphics, the Virtual Boy brings the ease of epilepsy, causing the headache, eye strain, even felt uncomfortable. From that problem, the Virtual Boy were considered commercial failure, where 770,000 units were sold, but it's still remembered as a unique part of Nintendo's history. In 1996, Nintendo launched Nintendo 64, where, of course, as the name, Nintendo want to bring the 64-bit gaming definition, and then they really want to bring the major leap to full 3D game graphics, although it still used the cartridge instead of CDs. Nintendo 64 is the first Nintendo home console to bring the real 3D camera movement, and that's why Nintendo brings the iconic controller with the analog stick in the middle, that designed for the 3D movement. And Nintendo 64 were sold for almost 33 million units during its lifetime. And Nintendo 64 bring the games like Super Mario 64, Super Smash Bros, GoldenEye 007, and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Because the Game Boy was a massive success in the 80s, Nintendo wanted to make a successor to the OG Game Boy by releasing the Game Boy Color in 1998. As of its name, the Game Boy Color supports the full color graphics. You're still able to play the original Game Boy games thanks to the backward compatibility, and you can play the original Game Boy games in living color. The handheld device that brings the games like Pokemon Crystal and The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons is bright, slim, and fun to carry around. And both for the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color were sold for almost 119 million units. So now it's time for us to enter in the new millennium, the 2000s, where Nintendo released the handheld device first. The handheld device that brings the big leap from its Game Boy's predecessor. Nintendo wanted to bring the 32-bit handheld gaming experience by launching the Game Boy Advance in 2001. The handheld device that also backward compatible with the original Game Boy and the Game Boy Color games comes with a wider and horizontal design, where it feels like you're holding a controller. And Nintendo also released the Game Boy Advance SP, where it's more convenient because of the flippable design, have a rechargeable battery, and have a backlight screen, where the original version of the Game Boy Advance must play under a lamp or sunlight. The handheld console that brings the games like Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, Metroid Fusion and Advance War were sold for over 81 million units worldwide. Nintendo didn't just release only the Game Boy Advance, but Nintendo also released the home console at the same year, which is Nintendo GameCube, that also released in 2001. The console that brings the iconic purple cube design and the carry handle is the first home console that uses a disc, even though it is a mini optical disc. The console that brings the games like Super Smash Bros. Melee, Mario Kart Double Dash, and Metroid Prime were struggled commercially against PlayStation 2 and Xbox, where almost 22 million units were sold. But the GameCube still became as beloved cult classic among Nintendo fans, even until today. After the success of the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo wanted to bring the new breakthrough when it comes to the handheld device. In 2004, Nintendo launched Nintendo DS that stands for dual screen because one of them is touchscreen. The DS were inspired by Game & Watch clamshell design, and it have a backward compatible with the Game Boy Advance games. The handheld that bring the games like New Super Mario Bros., Brain Age, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, and The World Ends With You brings the massive success, where 154 million units were sold. And Nintendo also released the other model for Nintendo DS, which is the DS Lite, that thin and lighter, and then the DSi that have internet access and the camera. And Nintendo wants to cap in the decade which brings the new revolution. In 2006, Nintendo launched Nintendo Wii, where the controller, the Wiimote, revolutionized the motion controls. And that's why Nintendo Wii brings the huge global success, even though it is lack of powerful graphics compared to the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, because Nintendo Wii were aimed for family and casual gamer. The console that brings the games like Wii Sports, Super Mario Galaxy, and Super Smash Bros. Brawl considered as one of the best-selling game console of all time, where almost 102 million units were sold. After the Wii success, Nintendo wanted to create the handheld device that became as the successor to the Nintendo DS. So, kicking off the 2010s era, Nintendo released the Nintendo 3DS in 2011, where it says it can display 3D without the glasses. Nintendo 3DS have a slow start at early launch, but it rescued by the price drop and a strong game lineup, such as Pokemon XY, Mario Kart 7, Animal Crossing New Leaf, and Super Smash Bros. 4, where it published for both 3DS and Wii U. The handheld that sold for almost 76 million units were also released in the other models, such as the 3DS XL that brings the bigger screen, and then the 2DS that have no 3D and kid-friendly, and of course the new 3DS that brings the faster processor. A year after the 3DS were released, Nintendo wanted to make the console that should be the successor to the Wii. So Nintendo released the Nintendo Wii U in 2012. The console that brings the games like Super Mario 3D World, Splatoon, Bayonetta 2, and Super Smash Bros. 4 brings the confusing concept that makes people were asked, is that a new console or just a Wii's accessory? And from that confusing concept, the Wii U were sold for only 13 million units. Talk about the gamepad. The Wii U have a touchscreen gamepad. It is good, but it is actually poorly executed. But that kind of controller pioneered Nintendo to make the next console in 5 years later, that later dubbed as the Nintendo's redemption arc. 5 years after the release of Wii U, Nintendo launched the Nintendo Switch in 2017. The hybrid console where you can play in a handheld mode, even you can dock to TV, brings the massive success where 154 million units were sold. And Nintendo Switch also introduced the controller called the Joy-Con, where the Joy-Con itself can be detachable and the Joy-Con have multiplayer ready because each side of the Joy-Con can be used separately. The hybrid console that bring the games like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and The Tears of the Kingdom, Super Mario Odyssey, Animal Crossing New Horizon, and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate brings the other models like Nintendo Switch Lite, which is handheld only, and Nintendo Switch OLED that brings the bigger, better, and improved quality. And Nintendo Switch also have a strong third-party support for the games like Monster Hunter, Skyrim, and Fortnite. And the release of Nintendo Switch capping off the 2010s decade. After the successful Switch, Nintendo wanted to upgrade it into the better looks, even performances, and that upgrade becomes as the first console in 2020s. In 2025, Nintendo launched Nintendo Switch 2. The Switch 2 is still a hybrid console, but it has a powerful hardware that brings the faster loading and the better graphics. The hybrid console that sold for 10 million units as of this video were created bring the games like Mario Kart World, Pokemon Legends ZA, and Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. However, you're still able to play the original Nintendo Switch games. Compared to the original Joy-Con from Nintendo Switch, the Switch 2 brings the improved Joy-Con with the magnetic features, and it claims it have a better ergonomics and durability. From simple playing cards in Kyoto to the consoles that connect the millions around the world, Nintendo's story is one of the constant innovation, risk-taking, and unforgettable games. No matter how much technology changes, Nintendo always finds a way to bring people joy. Thanks for tuning in this video. I hope you guys can enjoy it and you can add some information or give some corrections in the comment section. Stick around because the new episode will be broadcasted every Saturday and I'd love to have you with me, no matter what the world you're watching from. And see you on the next episode every Saturday on Saturday Stories. And in the end, I'm Luthfi. As always, have a great day and see ya.